it is recording.
It's hard to say. Yeah, I just saw a blink.
Okay. Yeah, it's blinking.
.965 on the pressure, guys. We should be in the eye shortly. I hope. Where is it, Jesse?
I don't know. I don't have coverage.
It stopped working?
It's gone.
Crap.
They say that necessity is the mother of invention. 14 years ago, during Category 4 Hurricane Charlie, I realized that there had to be a better way to observe the wrath of hurricanes without having to be there in person. It was on this day that the idea of using unmanned cameras was born. It became necessary.
Sure, it's HurricaneTrack, TRACK.com.
Almost immediately after Charlie, my team and I got to work, and by the time powerful Hurricane Ivan made its way to Gulf Shores, Alabama, the very first generation of unmanned cameras was ready. We outfitted an old Isuzu Rodeo with 3 high-8 cameras and several weather sensors and left it all out along the beachfront as Ivan roared ashore. Now all we had to do was stream it live, something that would be accomplished during the record-breaking 2005 season. In the months following Ivan, I began work developing the first unmanned camera system that would not only record video, but also stream it live to the internet. The technology consisted of a wired bullet cam, a laptop, a large marine battery for power, and a Sprint air card which would use the fledgling 3G network to stream it live. As it turned out, the first deployment was none other than Hurricane Katrina.
Look at the water and oh my God, look at this. Just incredible amounts of water coming in on Gulfport, Mississippi right now with a Category 4 hurricane.
The brutal 2005 season provided ample opportunities to put the technology to use. From Katrina to Wilma, it became obvious that using unmanned cameras in places that I couldn't possibly be in myself was not only smart, but also effective. For the next several years, there were not many changes to the concept, except to use yellow cases for better visibility in the event that we lost them. In 2008, Hurricane Ike was a milestone for the project. Our camera system that was placed in Bermuda Beach, just west of Galveston, captured the storm surge in spectacular fashion. But the camera units were heavy, expensive, and had limited runtime and overall quality. Nevertheless, for 9 years, this is what we used. And despite the flaws, the idea was proving to be successful. In early 2013, we began testing a Wi-Fi camera from Logitech that would stream video and audio directly to the Ustream platform utilizing a Verizon 4G LTE hotspot. For the next 2.5 years, I worked with my team to conduct extensive tests during winter storms and flood events. It was now possible to stream high-quality video with audio from virtually any location with an average runtime of over 30 hours. By the time the 2016 hurricane season rolled around, the slightly larger than lunchbox-sized cases were ready and set the bar for immersive live video unlike anything we had ever experienced before. The small camera boxes could go where TV reporters and storm chasers could not, right into the teeth of the action. During the 2017 hurricane season, the Logitech-based cams continued their winning streak, allowing me to bring the world incredible live video during Harvey's historic flood in Houston. But something happened during Hurricane Irma that would have a profound impact on the project. I had placed so much emphasis on streaming live, with nearly perfect success so far, that I had failed to plan for the possibility that we could lose the network signal and thus the live streams. No live stream equaled no saved video. Irma knocked out 4 of our 5 live feeds just as the eye wall was passing over. Fortunately, our camera in Naples remained online and gave us stunning live video. But the lesson was simple: develop a backup recording system as soon as possible. Immediately after Irma, I turned to our GoPro cams to solve the problem, and modified one to run for over 48 hours. Hurricane Nate in early October was the proving ground, and the idea of using a GoPro as a long-duration recording device proved worthy. We now had the ability to not only stream live video from virtually any location, but also to record it using GoPro cams as backup in the event that we lost connectivity to the live cams. What started out as an idea 14 years ago evolved into an important project that would utilize technology to solve the problem of how to capture the dangerous effects of hurricanes without having to put ourselves directly in harm's way. It is the winter of 2018. Not many people are thinking about hurricanes, but that's exactly what I'm doing. The cold, snow, and wind provide me with the perfect opportunity to continue to test equipment, all while covering extreme weather in the off-season. This winter storm would also be the last field mission for the Chevy Tahoe. Its time had come. After over 430,000 miles, more than 20 hurricanes, numerous tropical storms, and several winter storms, the Tahoe finally gave out, though it never failed during a field mission. It kept my team and I safe during some of the worst conditions imaginable, and helped us to collect weather data that is part of the historic record. For now, I would either rent an SUV or truck when needed, or use an 01 Tahoe that we had purchased in early 2017. I'll have more about that later. The old HurricaneTrack vehicle owed me nothing, a true testament to reliability when it really mattered. In early March, I began testing a new live camera system. The Logitech Wi-Fi cams that I had used since 2014 were in need of an upgrade. I was now trying out Nest cams, and a powerful nor'easter off the coast of Massachusetts was the perfect backdrop. This new camera system looked promising. It had a better overall image as well as tools to help with time-lapse and instant highlights. But the real advantage that the Nest Cam offered was superior runtime as compared to the Logitech's. During this test, I had achieved over 60 hours of runtime and still had battery life to spare. It seemed as though a viable replacement of the Logitech Wi-Fi cams was imminent. I was very excited about the potential. It is now early April and the first solid predictions for the 2018 Atlantic hurricane season are coming out. At the National Tropical Weather Conference in South Padre Island, Texas, Dr. Phil Klotzbach suggests a slightly busier than normal season. This was in contrast to the British company TSR, Tropical Storm Risk, and their forecast of a below average season. Meanwhile, Joe Bastardi of Weatherbell felt like the most intense storms would occur outside of the so-called main development region, a huge difference from 2017. Other predictions like this one from NC State, or this from AccuWeather, gave reason to believe that the 2018 season had potential to be busier than average, with the possibility of major impacts. Finally, at the end of May, the NOAA forecast called for the possibility of normal, or perhaps even an above normal season. All in all, no one had any idea of what was actually going to happen. Seasonal forecasting for hurricanes is extremely difficult at best. Nevertheless, these were some of the predictions, and the season was about to get underway. Toward the end of May, it looked like the threat of tropical development about a week ahead of schedule was likely. A disturbance in the northwest Caribbean Sea went on to become Tropical Storm Alberto. It was not very well organized and had top winds of 65 miles per hour out over the open water. The impacts would be minimal, but a rainy, breezy, and rough beach conditions weekend was in store for parts of the Florida Panhandle. For me, it meant that it was time to get to work. Remember when I said that the Chevy Tahoe was no longer operational? Well, this was one of those times that I rented a vehicle for the field work, in this case a Ford F-150, and I have to say, it was great. I'd never been to this particular part of Florida, and little did I know how ironic my presence here would be. Can you imagine coming through here in a 100-mile-per-hour hurricane? Eesh. I have a camera set up in Cedar Key, Carabel Beach, and now I'm headed to Mexico Beach, period. I stopped along the east side of Mexico Beach for some aerial shots of the Gulf. Just incredible knowing what would happen a few months later. I remember thinking of how vulnerable this area seemed to be. It was quite foreboding, to say the least. Alberto became a little better organized overnight, and by Monday morning it was bringing squally conditions to the region. I made my way out to Panama City Beach to fly the quadcopter for a look from above. The wind wasn't too bad, as evidenced by the fact that I was able to easily fly. As the morning progressed, I went back to Mexico Beach where I had a Nest Cam set up to monitor the action. Knowing what I know now about what would happen at this very spot, indeed for all of Mexico Beach, made me realize how quickly things can change in our lives. The nest cams all did great, even though Alberto itself didn't pack much of a punch. It was a solid start to the season in terms of testing out the new technology. The nest cams were going to prove to be a huge part of the success of the 2018 field operations. After Alberto, the hurricane season sputtered along through the month of June with little to no appreciable activity. Then, in early July, a small hurricane named Beryl formed in the deep tropics. Soon thereafter, Hurricane Chris reached peak intensity over the northwest Atlantic as Beryl tried to make a comeback in the subtropics. Maybe Joe Bastardi was right about his notion that the main development region would be hostile this season. The remainder of July was very quiet for the Atlantic Basin. It seemed as though this was going to be a very different season from 2017, when we saw the likes of Irma, Jose, and Maria in the deep tropics. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, things were very busy. However, there was something of note that was failing to occur: El Nino. Despite a lot of pre- and early season talk about a warming Pacific, it just wasn't coming to fruition. Interestingly enough, at the same time, the previously cooler than average deep tropical Atlantic was beginning to warm rather significantly. It was getting towards late August, and there were signals that the next few weeks could be quite busy in the Atlantic. For now, my attention was needed thousands of miles away in the Central Pacific as Category 5 Hurricane Lane was creating quite a stir for the Hawaiian Islands. It is Wednesday, August 22nd, and I'm on my way to Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands for Hurricane Lane. It is a long haul from Wilmington, North Carolina to Honolulu, but I was able to bring several of my remote cams with me just in case Lane turned out to be that rare historic hurricane for the region. I picked up my rental vehicle and scoped out the island for possible cam locations. Lane had potential to bring a lot of rain to the islands, which would easily lead to historic flooding. I had never been to Hawaii, and as such, I had my work cut out for me trying to find locations to set up the cams. Alright, so heading over to scope out a spot to put one of the cameras. This huge drainage channel reminded me a lot of the flood control measures taken in Houston. It was potentially a good site for a camera unit. Lane grabbed news headlines all over the world, and for good reason. Yet, there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty as to what the impacts would be. People were preparing even though the core of the hurricane was forecast to turn west just before reaching the Hawaiian Islands. I made my way to the interior of Oahu for some time-lapse video. Hey, Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com here in Oahu. It is about 6:30 p.m. Hawaii time, and I am over taking a time-lapse of those mountains that you see there behind me. Got the GoPro mounted up here on the back of the car, as you can see there, the rental, and it's taking a time-lapse. That's the thing about time-lapses. You have to let time elapse to get the video to compress later to get a good time-lapse. So I wanted to show the upslope flow of moisture that was streaming in ahead of Lane and how it would be squeezed out as rain over the mountains. If torrential rain were to make its way into the area, the mountains would enhance it and cause the normally beautiful streams and rivers to become swollen with raging floodwater, all headed downstream towards population centers. This was one of the potential threats from Lane. For the most part, Lane was more of a scare than anything else. Oahu fared quite well, although the Big Island and Maui both received heavy rain that caused localized flooding. I marveled at the beauty of the island, as Lane succumbed to very strong upper-level winds, tearing it apart and significantly reducing the impacts to Hawaii. As the long flight back to North Carolina commenced, I noticed a lot of chatter about an upcoming pattern change for the Atlantic Basin that could potentially result in a very busy period ahead. It is almost September, and the peak of the hurricane season was fast approaching. It is August 30th, and the Atlantic Basin is about to enter an active period during which several tropical cyclones will develop. This includes Florence, which is now just a tropical depression off the coast of Africa. Because of the long journey that it must make before reaching the United States, another system which will become Tropical Storm Gordon is going to form much closer to land. Computer models are generally very bullish on this system developing further in the Gulf of Mexico. Just a few days later, on September 3rd, Gordon becomes official as the 7th named storm of the season. Once again, it's time to hit the road. So it's about 9:30 Eastern Time, and I'm departing Wilmington, North Carolina. There it goes. Well, you really can't see it, but trust me, I'm leaving. Heading to the Mississippi Gulf Coast yet again for Tropical Storm Gordon. Got the Jeep Wrangler here, a rental, and it's all loaded with all kinds of gear. And not sure what's going to happen with this storm. It's small, over 29-30 Celsius water, so a lot could happen with it intensity-wise, or very little could happen intensity-wise. You just never know. Gordon quickly organizes and actually looks like a very small hurricane, complete with a tiny eye, just off the coast of southwest Florida. The forecast from the National Hurricane Center calls for Gordon to strengthen and reach hurricane intensity by the time it reaches the central Gulf Coast. As a result, a hurricane warning and a storm surge warning are posted. Hey everybody, it's Mark Suddeth, about 12 minutes after 9 Mississippi time, and I'm following these folks here that we met because of Hurricane Nate. They're in that Nissan there. Erin and her son going to show me a location to set up one of these surge cameras. Erin shows me the way to a great location along the bayou. This area was hit very hard by a massive surge from Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Her son and I made quick work of getting the remote cam up and running. My next stop was Biloxi, where the hurricane warning flags were flying. I met up with colleagues Derek Thompson and Carrie Mallory to place a cam out on the pier. If Gordon's worst impacts were headed this way, this perspective would be fantastic. We then made our way west to Pass Christian. The Mississippi coast is extremely vulnerable to storm surge, as we've seen from hurricanes such as Betsy, Camille, and Katrina. While Gordon was not expected to be a major impact event, I wanted to be sure we were ready with as many cams as possible. We worked well into the afternoon while Gordon continued to strengthen, threatening to become a hurricane before landfall. It was also turning a bit more north along its track, meaning that the center and worst effects were likely to be focused in Alabama and the extreme western Florida panhandle. It was time to head east. Alright everybody, it's about 5:20 in Mississippi and heading east into the Alabama area. A lot of the action's over there, but I think it's going to spread into Mississippi before too long. But figured, what the heck, let's go into Alabama and see what's happening over Mobile Bay. So that's where I'm headed now. Gordon was turning a little more to the north rather than moving west-northwest, and this meant that most of Mississippi would be spared any appreciable impacts. We all made our way down to the coast near Bayou La Batterie. Derek followed along in his truck, which included a mobile mesonet, much like my old Tahoe used to have. My good friend and colleague from Houston, Carrie Mallory, was riding shotgun with me. We were hearing reports of near hurricane conditions, including some storm surge at Dauphin Island. Meanwhile, back in Gulfport, it was a nice evening with virtually no sign of anything closely resembling a tropical storm. Just before dark, we made our way over to Pascagoula and found a nice open area to observe the effects of Gordon. Gordon was not much more than a reminder that it was peak time of the hurricane season, bringing torrential rain, tropical storm conditions, and scattered power outages to the region. Late that evening, the storm made landfall just below hurricane intensity. Most of the Mississippi coast was dry. In this instance, a slight change in track made a huge difference, and all of our equipment was actually well to the west of the worst conditions. It was now time to pay close attention to a hurricane that would again forever change the lives of many people in the Carolinas. North Carolina has a long and tumultuous history when it comes to hurricanes. The Outer Banks and Barrier Islands take the brunt of the fury as storm surge reshapes the coastline. But inland areas are also vulnerable as the remnants of once powerful hurricanes dump so much rain that it leads to an overland surge of water, causing rivers, streams, and creeks to overflow and flood the landscape. As Florence loomed, it looked as though another history-making hurricane was in store for the Tar Heel State, and indeed my hometown of Wilmington. What looked like a track out to sea scenario was quickly fading. By September 7th, the concern of direct impacts from Florence became more and more evident as new model data began to indicate a very strong ridge of high pressure over the western Atlantic. This would effectively block a turn to the north and eventually out to sea for the hurricane. Climatology, it seemed, would not be on our side this time. Over the weekend, the official forecast track shifted the center closer and closer to the Carolinas, and as an intense, large hurricane. Areas such as Wrightsville Beach, just miles from my home, were faced with a possible major disaster later in the coming week. Even though hurricanes are a part of history here, it doesn't make it any easier, especially with the significant increase in population over the past 20 years. Sunday night was the last opportunity that I would have for any decent sleep. This was probably true for everyone in the area. Alright, Mark Sudduth here. It's about 5:30 Eastern Time on Monday, September the 10th. I'm headed to Wrightsville Beach, where I will be meeting up with the Weather Channel, Mike Seidel, They want to do an interview talking about some of the equipment that I'm going to set up, the camera units, so I'm excited about that. The Weather Channel and other national and local media outlets were already in place covering the lead-up to the arrival of Florence. I had a quick segment with Mike Seidel to discuss the plan with the remote cameras. Then it was time to get started. I had a lot of ground to cover for this event, beginning with the Outer Banks. So look, the latest on Florence, I was talking to Jesse Bass, my longtime friend and colleague from Southeast Virginia, and he went over everything with me. And obviously the forecast has shifted north so that the threat to Myrtle Beach and Wilmington and Wrightsville Beach, etc., is beginning to diminish. The plot thickens because we don't really know what these weird model problems are. The European really locked in on a North Carolina-South Carolina border solution very consistently, and the GFS and other models, including the UK Met, are more towards the north and east, where it would impact a greater portion of the Outer Banks and down east North Carolina. So we're gonna have to just wait and see. By the 11th, it seemed as though it was a near certainty that Florence would make landfall and not turn harmlessly away. I was now in Rodanthe, along the North Carolina Outer Banks, ready to set up the first camera system. Ocean and seashore, the intersection. Look at all this sand. This is just from the issues they're already having. Nothing to do with the hurricane necessarily. Sand in the road, every high tide it overwashes here. I worked with the owner of the Rodanthe Pier to place one of our brand new Nest cams to stream live as Florence closed in. The air was thick, heavy, and full of energy. The Atlantic Ocean quite warm with plenty of fuel for the hurricane. The camera was secure and left out to fend for itself. With any luck, the live stream would stay up and we'd be able to see every moment of the way. My next stop was New Bern, where my passion for studying hurricanes was born. Leaving the Outer Banks, heading to New Bern, where I'm going to meet up with a gentleman who has flown up from the Virgin Islands to help me out. I was going to have help from one of our crowdfunding supporters who offered to fly up from St. John, rent a truck, and do whatever it took to help me out. Not bad considering that this guy himself endured Category 5 Irma just a year earlier. I arrived in New Bern around 8:30 Tuesday night, where Brent met up with me to begin helping with the mission. See that camera right there? That's the camera box. I'll show you real quick here. Just set it up here, and where's here? Down in Union Point in New Bern, North Carolina, along the Trent and the Neuse River area. New Bern was under the threat of a significant storm surge, as the wind field of Florence was likely going to push a tremendous amount of water up the Neuse River from the Pamlico Sound. But the camera is set up, the camera box right up there. Look how high it is. You can kind of get an idea above all of this out here. There's the water. You can see it a little bit. There's that gazebo over there, and that's going to be in the shot. The two of us worked to secure the camera box and provide what would be an incredible view along the waterfront in New Bern. It is now September 12th, and Florence is a lock for landfall somewhere near the Cape Fear region in about 48 hours. It is forecast to remain a very strong major hurricane, but there are signs that it may begin to weaken some, at least from a wind perspective. On the other hand, another potential huge issue is beginning to show itself: excessive rain once again. Similar to Harvey a year earlier in Texas, Florence was forecast to move very slowly or even stall once it had made landfall. This dire prediction meant that a very dangerous and destructive inland flood would commence, right on the heels of a significant flood event just 2 years ago in the wake of Hurricane Matthew. Our two live cameras were doing great. In Rodanthe, there was a noticeable increase in not only the surf, but also the high cirrus outflow clouds from the hurricane. In New Bern, it was a hot late summer day with scattered clouds. Slowly but surely the water levels were rising as the huge wind field of Florence exerted its force on the Atlantic and the Pamlico Sound. My task for the day was to work with Brent and our colleague from Mississippi State University, Greg Nordstrom, to place a third camera system in the small town of Oriental, also nestled along the Neuse River. Mark set off about 2 o'clock Eastern Time, and I'm with Brent over there, the driver. Finally have a driver. All right, he's in a rental. And back there is Greg Nordstrom, and we are heading to New Bern and then Oriental to deploy more equipment, etc. A little bit of cirrus canopy coming in. None of the rain bands are close to shore yet. We got a ways to go. 4:51 p.m. in Oriental, North Carolina. Look at all these cars that have parked up here on the bridge to be out of the way of the surge that will inevitably come. They know what's coming. The water is already coming up. We're going to put the camera right here. The pole has a little lean to it, so we're going to have to adjust accordingly. But that's going to be the shot right there. The amount of storm surge that this quaint town could experience was staggering, potentially more than 10 feet.
All right, so Greg, see that?
We placed the camera about 8 feet above the roadway. The locals say that this water level that you see here is definitely abnormal. Even though they do get a little bit of that king tide effect, this is a little bit more than they're used to seeing, and it's because Florence is pushing the Neuse River and the Pamlico Sound this way. With Oriental online, we now had 3 live camera systems running in anticipation of Hurricane Florence. As the evening progressed, it was easy to see that water levels were steadily coming up. This is really neat what they do from the National Hurricane Center, the Storm Surge Unit. And you can zoom in. This is interactive. On an iPad such as this, you can pinch zoom. All of those areas that are red, you know, we're talking in excess of 9 feet. All right? And we can look at the legend there, greater than 9 feet above ground. Blue is greater than a foot. Greater than 3 feet is generally considered life-threatening. So if we zoom in and look at eastern North Carolina, New Bern, Washington, Greenville, right, along the Pamlico Sound, the west end of the Pamlico Sound, up those rivers, very, very dangerous situation with that storm surge potential. We are now just about 24 hours from landfall, and even though Florence has weakened, the focus remains on storm surge and a possible catastrophic flood event. The Outer Banks are already experiencing strong wind and rough surf, though they will be spared the worst since the core of Florence will move well to the south. For the areas along the Pamlico Sound and Neuse River, things are only getting worse, as water levels steadily rise ahead of the hurricane. Back in Wilmington, I deployed one of our weather stations along the marsh area of Bradley Creek. I was not as concerned about the wind being a major factor as I was about storm surge and eventually the freshwater flood that we knew was coming. Time was running out, but we had one more very important mission: set up a live camera accompanied by a GoPro system in Surf City. 11:30 Eastern Time, Surf City Fire Department giving me an escort to set up a camera system here in the Surf City area in Pender County. In terms of storm surge directly from the Atlantic Ocean, it appeared from the latest available data that this stretch of coastline would likely experience a life-threatening and destructive surge. I worked with Brent to place the live camera along the walkway at a public access point. I knew that it was quite possible that the walkway would collapse, and that I would lose the camera into the ocean. To get the shot that I wanted, that was the risk that I had to take.
It says 23 hours, 3 minutes of runtime.
For this location, because we were less than a day from landfall, we would also deploy our brand new GoPro system that was modified to record for nearly 24 hours. This would be an important test of the backup recording system to the live camera. In fact, the camera box would be mounted on a utility pole on the other side of the dunes. The results of this idea to use a GoPro as a long-duration recording device would have enormous implications on future events. It had been tested numerous times, but this was the real deal. I needed it to succeed. Florence was slowing down as it inched closer to the North Carolina coast. We had 4 live cameras running covering almost 150 miles of coastline. The Weather Channel displaying our work for a national audience. The camera views were extraordinary. No one else had shots like these. Live video literally immersed within this history-making event. Unfortunately, it was just getting started as Florence was getting better organized.
Look at that. What a
Well,
difference.
yeah, it's compressing. The frictional effects is helping the storm compress, which you do see a lot in these situations. And also you start to see these kind of circular, almost like cuts within the eye here, and you see the eye kind of contracting and becoming a little bit more defined. These are little mesovortices that spin around. Mm-hmm. And while they're very hard to forecast and know exactly where they go, a lot of times these mesovortices cause the winds to increase. Sometimes as high as 10-20% higher than the actual winds are. So these little mesovortices spin around as a sign to me that it is starting to compress and strengthen.
And that's one of the things, especially with a hurricane, that it is as large as it is as far as the wind field is concerned. Even if we do see a better presentation on satellite, a drop in pressure, it's going to take a little while longer for those winds to respond to that, of course. But it certainly looks a lot more impressive on satellite than it did even earlier, just a few hours ago.
Folks, this is the view outside in my front yard in Wilmington, North Carolina.
As the night progressed, Florence continued to show signs of improved organization on radar. While it was technically a Category 1 on the Saffir-Simpson scale, which is a wind scale, the surge that it was pushing in to the coast was staggering. Here is New Bern on Wednesday afternoon. And now, late Thursday night. The eye of Florence was well south, meaning that it would not make landfall there. The giant wind field acted like a snowplow hundreds of miles wide, piling up the water into the coastline. In Oriental, the Neuse River had spilled into the town and was only about a foot below the bottom of the camera box, itself mounted around 8 feet above the road. It was a little after 10 p.m. Down east North Carolina was under siege from wind, rain, and worst of all, storm surge. The New Bern cam was downright eerie. Florence's winds finally knocking out the power. The flashes illuminated the sky enough to show an immense storm surge overtaking the historic city. In Wilmington, Brent recorded a news reporter in the deteriorating conditions from his hotel, only a few miles from Wrightsville Beach. It was now after midnight on Friday, September 14th. I was in my office monitoring the live cameras.
This is the New Bern camera at Union Point. That is water going over the camera. Unbelievable. And it is mounted probably 10 feet above the ground.
Florence is about to make landfall, crawling its way to shore as the forward motion has slowed to only a few miles per hour. The weather station along Bradley Creek indicates strong wind gusts and a falling pressure. The northern portion of the eye is moving over my house, having made landfall at Wrightsville Beach.
This is what it looks like from inside my dining room looking out towards the east. Wilmington, North Carolina. Oh, gosh. How are those pines not just snapping off?
You're getting close.
Because of the ridiculously slow forward motion, it allowed the eye to begin filling and become less defined as it moved across the Wilmington area. In my neighborhood, we never quite had calm conditions. Meanwhile, in Surf City, the live camera was holding on as the surge and wave action chewed away at the dune line. Remember that the live cam was mounted on the walkway leading down to the beach. Our GoPro case was mounted on a utility pole on the other side of the dunes. A few days after Florence had passed, the Surf City Fire Department retrieved the camera box, and I picked it up at the station headquarters. Needless to say, it was a huge win for the project. As I suspected would happen, the walkway succumbed to the waves and surge and fell into the surf, taking the live camera box with it. In this last frame that was captured before the camera went off the air, we can see the GoPro case mounted on the utility pole. What you are about to see is an incredible testament to the project, witnessing storm surge like we have never seen it before. As the morning progressed, the surge and wave action eroded the dunes completely. It goes without saying that it is a good thing that Florence was not any stronger than it was at the time of landfall. This surge was bad enough, and the historic flood was still looming. Had Florence maintained its Category 3 or 4 intensity, it would have resulted in catastrophic damage from the surge, let alone the wind. The GoPro did its job, giving us a look at the destructive power of the ocean from the front row. This is how it began when we set it up a day earlier. And this is how it ended. And thanks to the support from the Surf City Fire Department, we had something that will prove extremely valuable when it comes to understanding storm surge and educating the public. Florence was now inland over southeast North Carolina, but the impacts were still ongoing. In fact, the worst was yet to come in terms of the epic flood event that was about to grip the region. Maybe another 20 inches plus of rainfall A lot of these river basins around here, the Waccamaw, the Black River, parts of the Cape Fear River Basin, the Neuse River Basin, are going to go into major, maybe even record-setting flood stage over the next several days. Brent and I made our way out of Wilmington for a look at the immediate aftermath of the hurricane.
It's not going to take much more of this very heavy rain, these bands that are setting up over eastern North Carolina, to start closing parts of these roads with freshwater flooding. Wow. This is Pollexville, North Carolina.
Just like I had experienced with Harvey's remnants a year earlier in southeast Texas, the rainfall was extreme, and this was just day one. We made our way to New Bern for a quick look at my parents' house. They had evacuated well inland, but now had a large oak tree on the house to greet them when they came back.
Thank you, buddy.
The Weather Prediction Center indicated that another 2 feet of rain could fall over the next couple of days or more. On Saturday, more of the same. It's like the area was being carpet bombed by rain. The DOT was closing roads, including major interstates such as I-95. Brent and I found ourselves running into obstacles as we traveled around the region attempting to document the ever-changing situation. I used the quadcopter to take a look at just how extensive the flooding was on this stretch of country road. At 150 feet, the wind was still quite brisk, overpowering the stabilization mechanism of the quadcopter. Nevertheless, it confirmed our suspicions that the roadway was flooded too deep and too far. We had to turn around and try other routes, many of which were quickly becoming impassable. We also saw some strange things along the way. Now back at my house in Wilmington, the threat of tornadoes became the latest worry. Fortunately, none touched down in my neighborhood, but it made for an uncomfortable night as Brent and I tried to get some sleep. Two full days now after landfall, and still the rain falls as relentless as ever. Rivers, streams, and creeks are overflowing and continuing to cut off access to the Wilmington area. However, we had an important task. The National Weather Service was forecasting the Little River near Spring Lake, North Carolina, to exceed record flood stage in the coming days. We had one live cam available to place in the area to monitor the situation.
That's the Serve Pro truck. That's ironic.
So many roads had become inundated with rising water, with scenes like this playing out all across much of southeast North Carolina and now northeast South Carolina. Once again, I took to the air with our quadcopter to get a better handle on the scope of the flooding in this area, which was near Riegelwood, North Carolina along Highway 87. It is easy to see from this vantage point just how widespread the water was, swallowing up entire communities, and not just in rural areas. Even Wilmington and its surrounding neighborhoods were experiencing major to catastrophic flooding. We pressed on despite the challenges of so many closed roads. Luckily, we had a solid wireless data signal and can make use of Google Maps to help navigate the maze. It took several hours battling the blinding rain, but we finally made it to the Manchester community near Spring Lake to set up the last live camera of the mission. This was the intersection of Highway 24 and West Manchester Road. The Little River was forecast to rise more than 20 feet above normal and flood this area within the next 48 hours. That is exactly what happened. Over the coming days, things went from bad to worse across vast portions of North Carolina and South Carolina as the historic rain from Florence transformed the landscape into a water world. Outside aid had a very difficult time reaching Wilmington and other smaller towns across the region. People did what they could to clear debris and make travel perhaps a little easier. Still, the hazards lingered for days on end and included rafts of fire ants trying to survive the flood themselves. It had been 3 days since Florence lumbered its way to shore in southeast North Carolina. People were desperate to get from point A to point B, whatever the reason was for travel. At night, it became especially hazardous for obvious reasons.
He's past his knees already.
Day 4 was much of the same. Roads closed and rising water across much of the coastal plain of the Carolinas. U.S. Highway 421, a major corridor leading in and out of Wilmington, was literally cut in half by the flood. It would be days before conditions improved and the recovery phase could truly begin. In downtown Wilmington, the Cape Fear River was spilling into the streets at each high tide cycle. Naturally, I thought it would be interesting to see what this looked like through time lapse. So, I set up a GoPro cam unit to find out. For the next 3 days, the GoPro took a photo every 10 seconds, resulting in this unique look at an event that would affect the region for years to come. Wilmington proper was in decent shape overall, with trees down, widespread power outages, and the overall inconvenience of dealing with the hurricane. It was the small towns and communities that suffered from record flooding, surpassing Floyd and Matthew with ease. Farming and livestock interests were devastated, leaving many with nothing and little hope of recovery. All of this from a hurricane that at one time looked like a monster because of the wind. Yet it was the water, storm surge, and rain that has earned Florence its place as North Carolina's costliest natural disaster.
What happened to the fence?
What happened to the fence?
What happened?
It was from the hurricane,
Why?
from the ocean. My children are now a part of the hurricane generation. Their world changed enough for them to notice. The novelty of the eroded dunes, damaged sand fences, and the seabirds who lost their battle against the winds and tides would wear off soon enough. That's just part of being a kid. For their father, I knew that we were extremely lucky. Hard to imagine considering the flooding that had cost so many so much. We were lucky. The ocean conspires with the atmosphere to give birth to these immense forces of nature. As bad as it was, Florence could have been so much worse. I wonder how many people truly understand that. As the month of September came to an end, the signals began showing up that another child of the tropics would soon be born. This time in the Caribbean Sea. Its name would be Michael, and it would put our technology to the ultimate test while leaving behind unimaginable damage. The first advisory from the National Hurricane Center was issued on Saturday, October 6th. Initial thoughts were that Michael would be a sheared, late-season storm, perhaps similar to Nate almost exactly a year ago. No one was prepared for what would happen just 4 days later. I had just returned to North Carolina from Arizona, where I was documenting the flooding from East Pacific Hurricane Rosa in the desert Southwest. Time was short. I had to quickly gather equipment and be ready to head to the Florida Gulf Coast, again with help from Brent Lynn, who was flying in from St. John to assist with the field work. Our plan was to set up equipment covering over 150 miles of coastline to capture the impacts from Michael. We deployed live camera systems in Cedar Key, St. Marks, East Point, Gulf Pines, and Mexico Beach. East Point and Mexico Beach would have GoPro camera systems as a backup to record whatever happened in the event that the live cameras went offline. Our weather station would go just west of Panama City, on the Hathaway Bridge. The process began in Cedar Key early Tuesday afternoon. We were coordinating our efforts with the Emergency Management Director. He was concerned that Michael could rival Hurricane Hermine just 2 years ago and put his town underwater from storm surge. Next up was St. Marks. It is now late Tuesday afternoon, and Michael has strengthened into a major hurricane, with winds of 120 miles per hour. We scout locations near and east of Indian Pass, an area that could experience a truly devastating storm surge. Everything was highly dependent upon the exact track of Michael. Evening came, the last sunset before lives, and indeed the way of life itself, would be changed in such a profound way. Michael continued to get stronger and threatened to reach Category 4 intensity before landfall. We had the technology to capture whatever happened, no matter how severe the impacts, all while keeping ourselves out of the worst danger. The third location for our cameras was East Point, just north of St. George Island and Apalachicola Bay. This site would have a live camera and a GoPro backup cam. The GoPro was modified to give us 23 hours of high-definition video, enough to cover the landfall, which was now only about 15 hours away. The live camera worked great until just after sunrise on Wednesday the 10th. We really don't know what happened, but it went offline. Luckily, we had the GoPro as backup, and you are seeing this video now because of that fact. The fourth location for a camera was in the Gulf Pines area just east of Port St. Joe. We were now joined by Derek Thompson, who brought his mobile mesonet truck from South Dakota. the three of us worked to place the camera on the front piling of a home in Gulf Pines, in coordination with the owner who had contacted us via Twitter. It is such a strange feeling to leave a camera box behind. I realize it's not a living thing, but a lot of time and effort goes into preparing each camera for what could be the last time we ever see it again. Obviously, this is a better scenario over not ever seeing one of us again. The final location for a camera system was Mexico Beach. I was here in late May for Tropical Storm Alberto and remembered the drive along Highway 98, through what is known as the Forgotten Coast. It is called this because of the quaint old Florida coast. Absent are the towering hotels and condos that are icons of the beaches farther to the west. Two cans of Mexico Beach would be the focal point of the shot. This was totally by accident. We had no idea of its history or what the restaurant meant to the people of the area. Camera number 5 was up and running. Michael was now forecast by the National Hurricane Center to make landfall Wednesday afternoon as a Category 4 hurricane. The unmanned cameras would need to stand strong to record and document this historic event. Our final task was to get our state-of-the-art weather station mounted and operating over the waterway between Panama City and Panama City Beach. This would provide us with near real-time measurements of barometric pressure and wind speed from an elevated and exposed location. Michael was nearing landfall as a very dangerous Category 4 hurricane. Its eye cleared out and well defined now. Our cameras were doing great. Their views through the use of time-lapse revealed a unique look at the conditions over 150 miles of coastline. A remarkable achievement and use of technology, especially considering that we do this with a very limited budget. Passion and persistence can go a long way. So far, as morning broke, we weren't seeing anything too severe, but we knew that the impacts from Michael were just getting started. By the time the intermediate advisory from the National Hurricane Center was issued at around 8 a.m. Eastern Time, Michael had strengthened further, with maximum sustained winds of 145 miles per hour. The central pressure had lowered to a staggering 933 millibars. The radar presentation was all at once spectacular and ominous, a calm eye surrounded by a ferocious eye wall. All of this still to the southwest of Panama City and our location at the Hampton Inn. Just before 9 a.m. local time, Brent and I decided that we needed a GoPro cam set up in Mexico Beach. I was certain that the live feed would be lost, and with it, our chance to capture something truly remarkable. Something that could help our understanding of what happened during the worst of Michael. As we passed through Callaway, Parker, and Tyndall Air Force Base, we knew the importance of what we were doing. This was our one chance to use technology to show the world something that no one has ever seen before. We also went by a huge open area where a research team was setting up a tower to monitor wind and pressure readings.
That's the weather station.
Yeah, they better hurry the heck up.
For all of us, time was running out. The core of Hurricane Michael was just 3 hours from reaching the coast. Driving into Mexico Beach was surreal. It was virtually empty, with only a few other vehicles seen. Some were media, Others were hurricane chasers there to document this historic event. As we approached, the live camera caught our arrival as we passed toucans of Mexico Beach. We pulled into the Exxon gas station parking lot and right next to the utility pole that had the Nest Cam mounted already. It was time to get to work and deploy the GoPro, which was housed inside of a military spec case.
It is recording.
Brent prepared a ratchet strap that would secure the case against the utility pole as if it had been bolted on. Rock solid.
I just saw a blink.
After one last check, it was up to fate now. Whatever happened over the next few hours would hopefully be captured by the GoPro. Across our network of live cameras, we could see the impacts from Michael steadily increasing. Our Mexico Beach camera showed a scene that was deceptively calm, with just some wind and rain. Brent and I returned to the Hampton Inn in Panama City to meet with Derek and our Houston colleague Carrie, who had joined us late Tuesday night. At this point, we needed to decide whether or not we would be able to launch a special weather balloon into the eye. The only problem was that we needed the eye to go directly over our hotel, since it was beyond dangerous to try to venture out into it ourselves. A look at the data from our weather station confirmed that. The lobby was filled with news crew personnel. I wondered if they had any clue as to what was coming or how bad it was going to get. This video from our East Point GoPro shows what was coming. The live camera feed from Gulf Pines was alarming. We could see the water rising quickly as Michael closed in. In Mexico Beach, the wind was already taking a toll on the structures there, well ahead of the storm surge. Back in Panama City, we mentally prepared for the onslaught that was about to commence. The time was a little after 11 a.m. Central. Michael was now on the cusp of becoming a Category 5 hurricane. For this portion of the Florida Panhandle, the clock was about to run out. Our live camera in Mexico Beach witnessed the roof ripping off of toucans, a sign that the wind was increasing enough to cause substantial damage. And yet, there was no sign of storm surge. The same could not be said for the Gulf Pines and East Point areas. This is why storm surge is so dependent on the exact track of a hurricane as well as the shape of the coastline.
Toucan lost her roof, I heard.
Look at Mexico Beach. Just complete whiteout.
Panama City was now within the core of Michael. Hurricane conditions had arrived. Our hotel was being torn apart, as were scores of other homes and businesses across the city and elsewhere, as the core of what was now Category 5 Hurricane Michael overtook the area.
town is going to be trashed.
It's just a little after 12 noon, and Michael is making landfall as a Category 5 hurricane between Panama City and Mexico Beach. Our weather station indicating wind speeds over 100 miles per hour, and this was not the worst part of Michael's core. East Point was being overtaken by surge. In Gulf Pines, we began to see ocean waves rolling in on top of the storm surge, adding to the already destructive force of the event. Our live cam in Mexico Beach was beyond anything we had ever seen before. Through the whiteout conditions of the eye wall, we could make out a building being moved across the street by the surge. This shot is extraordinary because it was live at the time. Somehow the Verizon LTE signal that carried the NestCam feed remained intact, giving us an unprecedented front row seat to history in the making. Our hotel had been torn open by the force of the wind. Guests were huddled in the hallways. Most had no idea of how their homes were standing up to Michael. Defying belief, our live cam in Gulf Pines was still transmitting, allowing us to view the storm surge as if we were right there in the middle of it. In East Point, we had no live feed for unknown reasons, but the GoPro cam unit, which was retrieved for us several days later by the National Weather Service Tallahassee, revealed the extent of the impacts from Michael. In Mexico Beach, the live shot was gradually losing its battle against the onslaught of unimaginable fury. These are the last seconds of the live camera's broadcast before it lost the signal. We would now have to hope that against almost insurmountable odds that the GoPro camera case survived, which would give us important clues about not only what happened, but how it happened. With the live cam off air now, we had no idea of the true fate of Mexico Beach. The eye of Michael was now moving inland. We would miss it by only a few miles, and as such would not be able to launch our special weather balloon payload. Our choice to stay put in the relative safety of the hotel is one that I'd make again if given the chance. We just can't risk our safety even in the name of science and discovery. Our hotel was like a sinking ship, filling up with water from the gaping holes that Michael's core had left behind. Even this far east of the core of the hurricane, we could see the devastating surge and the wind damage that was taking place. In Panama City, conditions began to improve as Michael pulled away. Our hotel was wrecked, trapping and crushing several vehicles from a national news crew. Fortunately for them, they were inside when it happened. Brent and I wanted to venture out and take a look at the impacts. This proved to be quite challenging as many roads were blocked by fallen trees or other debris.
That's over the embankment, man.
Blew that car over the embankment.
As we made our way around Panama City, we made a decision. We would try to get back to Mexico Beach to retrieve the GoPro cam, assuming it was still there. We figured that our chances of getting back to Mexico Beach that evening were almost zero. It was worth a try. If the GoPro camera box was still there, and it didn't have any issues, we needed to get it quickly before something happened to it and the video data was lost forever.
We got this one. Yep. Your 4-bind. I got roll. Alternative route. Transformer.
No, that's not a loop on a roller coaster. That is a radio tower. Steel radio tower.
The sunset was truly magnificent as we crossed the bridge over East Bay. Once we reached Tyndall Air Force Base, it became apparent that Michael had caused substantial damage. The pine forest along Highway 98 all but completely leveled. Then something remarkable happened. The sky was ablaze with a deep red that made us feel like we were on another planet. It was now dark. We came upon the ruins of the wind tower that was set up by researchers just hours before Michael made landfall. We wondered, what kind of wind speed could knock over a research-grade steel tower? After dodging a gauntlet of downed trees and power lines, we had made it back to Mexico Beach. What would we find? How bad was it? Our task was to get from the bridge and canal area to where Toucans of Mexico Beach once stood. That is where the GoPro camera box was hopefully still attached to the utility pole. We were greeted with a grim scene. Mounds of debris blocked the road. Memories of the past now scattered by the rage of wind and surge. How on earth were we supposed to get through all of this for the next 2 miles? As it turned out, there was someone that I knew standing right there with Brent and me. His name is Tony Bright. Like me, he is from Wilmington, North Carolina. Tony also documents hurricanes, but does so more for his own interest and fascination. He was right there in the westernmost portion of Mexico Beach and captured some amazing handheld video. After a brief conversation about what we were up against, Tony agreed to accompany Brent and me to look for the GoPro camera case. And so the trek began. Into an unknown world we traveled. We ran across an elderly gentleman who was stumbling around in the dark amongst all of this wreckage. Tony gave him a flashlight, some water, and a granola bar. None of us had any idea of why he was there. We pressed on. This was the immediate aftermath, only hours after Michael's passage. Even in the darkness, our flashlights exposed what was a forever changed Mexico Beach. Our journey was challenging but generally uneventful. We were very careful of where we stepped and mindful of our surroundings. Obviously, we were able to retrieve the camera box. I think you know that by now. In the context of our story, at this point that night, we didn't even know if it still existed as we had left it prior to Michael's landfall. We didn't know that it was still waiting for us like a silent sentry, manning his post. Indeed, it saw us coming for it, waiting for us right where we had left it. Both camera boxes were still intact and the GoPro was actually still recording. We elected not to even mess with it and just leave it running inside the case until we got back to our vehicle. After retrieving both cases, we went a few blocks east where it appeared that a fire was burning. There was no one else there. No police, no fire department, no onlookers, just the three of us. We hadn't a clue as to how it might have started. The stiff breeze fanned the flames for hours. The return trip back to the vehicle was grueling. We were exhausted. We needed a break and actually took a nap for about a half an hour on the bare pavement of US Highway 98. The GoPro cam, still recording, captured the relative sound of silence as the three of us laid on our backs and stared at the brilliant winks of light of the universe above us. Our brief slumber was interrupted by a very distinct sound. It was a helicopter. It was difficult to see, but it looked like someone had been lowered from the chopper to the ground and began running into the darkness. Sure enough, it was someone from the United States Coast Guard. He told us that he was there to check on a woman in her early 90s who had stayed behind. Her family was very worried about her. The entire first floor had been swept away, and he needed to get to the third floor where she was supposed to be located. Tony assisted, becoming a human ladder. He and Brent made their way up and helped to locate the woman, the GoPro cam bearing witness. It was like a house of horrors in there. Dark, musty, and dangerous.
Oh, yeah, man, seriously. Yeah, no, the third story. Somehow.
After searching through the maze of wreckage inside the condo, the woman along with her granddaughter were located and evacuated from Mexico Beach. I wondered what she was thinking as she stepped into that basket. Brent, Tony, and I made it safely back to where we had started several hours prior. Tony went back to the condo where he had filmed Michael's wrath, staying with a family that he had met just that day. Brent and I got some sleep back at my vehicle. The wind had calmed and only the sounds of dying alarms cut through the night air. It had been exactly 12 hours since Mexico Beach was changed forever. The scope of the disaster was immense, and this was right on the heels of Hurricane Florence and the overwhelming flooding that was taking place in the Carolinas. We departed Panama City on Thursday the 11th and drove to Montgomery, Alabama for the night. Our route along Highway 231 gave us a look at the massive recovery effort that was already underway. On Thursday evening, Brent, Derek, Carrie, and I gathered in front of a large screen television at our hotel and finally took a look at what the GoPro from Mexico Beach had captured.
You gotta do the 10-minute run.
Yeah, man, I just started it. This one we're just gonna have to hope for the best.
The live cameras did their jobs, providing us with real-time sights and sounds as Michael plowed into the Florida Panhandle. But it was the tiny cameras that we know of as GoPros that ultimately came through. The lessons applied from past seasons, both from successes and failures, resulted in truly unprecedented video of how a Category 5 hurricane does what it does.
It's hard to say. I just saw a blink. Okay. Yeah, it's blinking.
12 days after the landfall of Michael. I returned to the area to pick up our remaining camera boxes. The utility pole that we used to mount the cameras, still there. This was their new reality, a 24-hour-a-day reminder of the hurricane. They say it only takes one storm, one hurricane, to make it a bad season. For people in the Carolinas, the Florida Panhandle, and even areas far inland, it was two very different hurricanes that will come to define a generation. The painful irony is that the Category 1 hurricane, Florence, killed more people than Category 5 Michael. We track hurricanes out of some unexplainable fascination with their brute force and raw power. Perhaps seeing our world this untamed gives us better perspective and appreciation for the lives that we live each and every day. When the hurricanes come again, we will try once more to unlock their secrets. We owe it to those whose lives were lost during past hurricanes. I'm Mark Sudduth. Thanks for watching.